good afternoon if you are, let's say, in Cincinnati or New York City or much of North America, Central and South America. Good evening if you are in Europe, and let's say in Ireland, if your name is something like Milligan, or anywhere across the continent and in Africa. Special greetings and love to our loved ones in Ukraine. Greetings overnight to people all throughout Asia, the southern part of the equator, Australia, New Zealand, and people in the West Coast of the United States and South America. This is Fred Plotkin on Fridays. That makes me Fred Plotkin. This is on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. And as listeners this month know, this is June of 2022. My theme this month has been to pick people who inspire me to join me as guests. And the next guest is on July 1st. He inspires me too. We'll let him in. But this is the last guest for June, is Christopher or Chris Milligan, the Harry Fath General Director and CEO of the Cincinnati Opera. Welcome, Chris.
Fred, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to see you and a pleasure to be in conversation today.
So I think what I'd like to do is start by introducing our listeners to Cincinnati and the Cincinnati Opera, simply because they may not know it. They should know it. People who know opera very well know of the special aspects of the Cincinnati Opera that we'll get into. But even among opera companies in the United States, and we have many, it is, if not quite unique, almost unique, and very, very special for a whole bunch of reasons. Am I right so far?
You are right so far.
So what I'm going to ask you to do is talk not about the opera, but about the city of Cincinnati, where it is, its history, how it might have created an opera company. I'll say this up front. Founded in 1920, making it the second oldest opera company in America after the Metropolitan Opera.
Thank you, Fred. So Cincinnati, first thing to say is we live in a tri-state region here in Cincinnati. It's we're on the Ohio River, and we have across the river Kentucky, and then across our border, then Indiana. And Cincinnati is, the city itself, I think, is some 250 years old or something like that, and has a long tradition around the themes of art and culture. At one point, Cincinnati was one of the nation's largest cities.
It was sixth largest, I know that.
Sixth largest, yeah, yep. Indeed. I am, I'll tell you right now, in Music Hall, which itself is an amazing story. This building was built in 1878. And in many ways, there was an influx of a German population that came to Cincinnati and brought many beautiful traditions with them. And one of them was choral singing. This building was established to be the home for the May Festival, which is a choral tradition that goes back many years. And there's a legendary story, we think it's true, of the May Festival performing one season under what was then a tin roof. And it turns out if it rains on a tin roof, that's very loud. And finally, the decision was made. We need a proper venue for this sort of thing. Music Hall became the center of gathering for the city, and even hosted both the Democratic National Convention and the Republican National Convention in the late 1800s, and became kind of a convention center of sorts, hosting a number of different small-scale World's Fair kind of activities. Music Hall was not the original home of Cincinnati Opera, as you well know, Fred.
Well, let's get to that in a bit.
Yes.
But I want to talk more about the city itself.
Yes.
I'll jump in now. For people who don't know, it's on the Ohio River, which separates historically the North from the South in the United States. But it also, Kentucky in the Civil War was part of the North, part of the Union Army, but is really in many ways a Southern state. So this river is much more than just a river. It's also a navigable highway that meant commerce from the east of the United States all the way to the Mississippi River and down to the Gulf of Mexico. And therefore, Cincinnati became a very important commercial center early on because of the river. What it also was the place where Black people, African Americans, fleeing slavery, enslavement in the South, managed to get north and landed very often in Cincinnati. So that there's a notable Black community in Southern Ohio. I can name many famous people from that area. I think Toni Morrison, the Nobel Prize winning writer, was from that part of Ohio. Kathleen Battle, the opera singer, is. There are many. And so it's a notable community. Black people have been a big part of the culture, the gastronomy, the workforce in Cincinnati. The Germans created a lot of the cultural landmarks. In fact, one of the neighborhoods is called Over the Rhine, above the Rhine.
Over the Rhine, yes.
Over the Rhine. So that while for us it's the Ohio River, for the Germans it reminded them of the Rhine River. And Cincinnati has hills, and Cincinnati is named for Cincinnatus, an ancient Roman. And the city fashioned itself justifiably as something of a mecca of culture, not just in the Germanic sense, but in the ancient Roman Renaissance sense. There is this wonderful library there called the Mercantile Library that I've spoken at. It's one of the most beautiful libraries I know anywhere. And any city that dedicates itself to being a place where culture gathers, in addition to commerce, is very distinct. And what makes Cincinnati particular for me, it's not the only one. Boston and New York and Venice and other places are like this. But Cincinnati, from the very beginning, has combined commerce and culture. It has had an important Italian community, a Jewish community. The great conductor James Levine was from Cincinnati. The Cincinnati Conservatory of Music is one of the best. I've taught classes there. It is, for what is now a frankly small-ish city compared to many, it punches way above its weight in terms of its cultural impact on a national and international level. It has a fine art museum. It has a wonderful symphony, one of the oldest in the country as well. And I think the fact that Music Hall, which was out of commission and then restored, exists and is much older than our theaters in most of the country. There's one that's as old in Philadelphia, means that that building stands as a reminder of Cincinnati's dedication to culture. And whether people are actually in love with classical music, with opera, with other things presented there, I've always noticed in Cincinnati that people are very proud of the cultural traditions of the city, even if they don't partake as much as they might. I will add only that you, Chris, have specialized in outreach, and therefore it's not for lack of trying and lack of availability that people don't partake, but they just don't. But that is very particular too, because frankly, in a city, in a population that's small compared to others, you need a devoted audience to make your endeavor work. So that's it. You add more about Cincinnati. Go ahead.
I'll mention the metropolitan population of Cincinnati is 2.2 million, just to give folks a sense of the population here in the city. And yeah, I'll say that we often think of ourselves as the northernmost southern city and the southernmost northern city, being right here at the border at the Ohio River. I'll mention too that in 2005, and you know this, Fred, that we did an opera called Margaret Garner, and this was based, in fact, on Toni Morrison's book Beloved, and told the story actually from the 1850s of an enslaved woman who made her way across the frozen Ohio River to freedom in Ohio. But at the time, the Fugitive Slave Act was enforced, and was kidnapped and ended up sacrificing her children rather than allowing them to live in slavery an extraordinary project for us as a company. It was a partnership with our friends in Detroit and Philadelphia, who also mounted the production. Premiered in Detroit in 2005. We had it a month later, but was in so many ways a coming together of the city around this idea. The National Underground Railroad Freedom Center is also here in Cincinnati and a regular partner for a number of our programs. And we commissioned the work with Denise Graves, co-commissioned the work as in honor. For us, it was in honor of the opening of the National Underground Railroad Freedom Center. What we love about Cincinnati, those of us who live here, is that there's so much history. As I say about some communities, they tore down their music hall. Our music hall, for whatever set of reasons, still exists. And I'll tell you, the window you see behind me looks out onto Washington Park, and that is a revitalized park as of 2012. But if I look out the window 3 times, at least 1 in 3 times, there's someone taking a photo of music hall. I love most to see an older person pointing the building out to a younger person and passing along. Here is the story of our community. Here is one of the cultural treasures of our community that matters, and sharing that story. We could go a number of different directions about music hall, but there are 2 tours that are important to mention. One is a regular tours of the building, just as a place where classical music happens. And then also there's a series of ghost tours, which are, at least on social media and sometimes television, also more popular than the classical music offerings. I've worked here since 1997. I've not seen a ghost, but it's intriguing. It's interesting. I'll say a little bit about our early days. Are you ready to move to that? Because it's just so
I just want to add one more thing about out your window
for sure.
Music hall. That if I were to have my back to that window and walk a block forward and then a block to the left, is there still a Grader's ice cream shop there?
How do you remember that? Yes.
Because
yes.
For people who don't know, Grader's is a Cincinnati ice cream brand that really is fantastic. And there was a period before the pandemic when we used to be able to get it in New York in limited amounts in a couple of stores. And now, unfortunately, not.
Is that right?
Yeah, they produce wonderful ice cream throughout the year, but especially right now, they make peach ice cream. That's just the best ice cream I know, period. And
it's called the technique is a French pot, is the technique of making the ice cream. It is amazingly rich and colder somehow than most ice creams. The most popular flavor is the black raspberry chip, which I don't know. It's one of those, once you have it, you can look on other things on the menu, but you always somehow end up with the.
Well, it's really wonderful, but I opt for the peach. And this leads us in a way to the fact that Cincinnati Opera has always had its season in late spring, early summer. So when I've attended, as I've had the pleasure for many years of attending performances, it's right in the middle of peach ice cream season. And the black raspberry is
just
great
for you.
But it's really something memorable, so much so that at the airport, which is in Kentucky, the second I land, I get some Grader's ice cream, and the last thing I do before I depart is again get some Grader's ice cream at the shop at the airport. I mention this seriously because good food and good attention to detail and quality is something. And that ice cream is excellent. I mean, I live in Italy part of the time, and Italy has gelato, which is amazing. This is a very different type. It's very rich and buttery and fat oriented, but like Italian ice cream, very flavor forward, so that those peaches are real local peaches.
Yes.
The raspberries are excellent. And this devotion to quality and the fact that there is a community that supports it is notable to me in a time when there is such mass globalization of so many things, whether it's flavor, whether it's music, whether it's fashion, that part of the appeal to me of Cincinnati has always been it cherishes what it has, it honors what it has. And I'm going to add further, and you correct me if you think I'm wrong, I've noted that because Cincinnati is relatively smaller, the major industries of the town and the community support the arts and support other things because it attracts a better quality employee to Cincinnati if they have the assets of the May Choral Festival, of the Cincinnati Symphony, of the Cincinnati Opera, that, let's say, people are coming from Europe or South America, anywhere, and they want to live in a city that has good medical care, but also very fine arts institutions on a world class. Those corporations in Cincinnati make that possible in ways that I don't see. I'll name a comparable city, Philadelphia. I don't see the same dedication. I love Philadelphia, but I don't see the same dedication to supporting the arts by corporations that I do in Cincinnati.
I'll mention two in particular. I think you're right about that, Fred. There's two in particular, and they're I guess they're older than Cincinnati Opera, both of them. One is Procter & Gamble, headquartered here in Cincinnati. The other is the Kroger Company, also a mainstay in the community for a long time, and both of them very supportive of the positive cultural traditions of our community, and we're so glad to see that and be in partnership. And you're right that it is certainly part of the benefits that are mentioned when we want to hire you away from Toronto or from San Francisco, and folks are delighted, truly delighted to learn that not only is there this tradition with regard to symphonic music, but also opera, also ballet with the Cincinnati Ballet, and many other fine institutions.
Shakespeare Theater. There's an excellent
Theater,
Shakespeare
indeed.
Theater there. Yeah.
In fact, I was just talking to someone last night. We had our second performance of Bohème last night, and this gentleman was just remarking, he was from out of town, and he just said, it's extraordinary that, that Cincinnati has this, and he kind of gestured to music hall and the quality of the performance and the orchestra. I just wouldn't have guessed that with a city this size, but it's part of a legacy that goes back, and we're glad to see those values and traditions passed on from one generation to the next. And the joy that folks experienced last night is a testament to that.
And I'm going to name two more things that are legacy. I forget the name of the market, but it's from 1852. It's a wonderful outdoor market. What's it called?
Findlay Market.
Yeah. That I always go to when I'm in Cincinnati, because many of the shareholders, it's been passed down through generations, and some are African American and some are German and some are all the groups that we've mentioned. And that market, there's a wonderful market in Cleveland, by the way, on the west side of Cleveland. And it struck me, which is also Ohio, it struck me that Ohio has markets that are not trendy, but they are excellent in terms of food and so on. And
it's very much a destination. Difficult to find parking on Saturday mornings.
Yep.
And you'll be glad to know that there are a number of new bakeries there as well. The one next time you're in town, the one you'll have to try is the Blue Oven and their English muffins. Oh my gosh. I will drive downtown just for that.
Okay. And the other thing I wanted to mention is about legacy, that baseball is the national pastime in the United States, and baseball originated really in the East Coast of the United States. And many of the great teams originally were in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, and so forth, and Chicago. And Cleveland, but the other historic team, I think the oldest in America, was the Cincinnati Redlegs, now called the Cincinnati Reds. They have a stadium that's close to the Museum of the Underground Railroad, if I recall.
Both right on the river.
On the river. And people who love opera tend to love baseball and vice versa. So I've always found it very enjoyable in Cincinnati when I come for opera to also go to a ball game, because there too, it's treated as something older and a legacy, and not as something to commercialize. And the team has had good years, it's had less good years, but the fan base is very devoted.
Very devoted, yes.
And So the richness and the diversity of the quality of life in Cincinnati, to me, is always very palpable. There are foods that are very local, just to Cincinnati, not all to my taste, but that doesn't matter. Um,
So, Fred, can I interrupt for just a second? When you
yes,
and I exchanged messages in advance of this call, you said I should feel free to ask you questions
go
too.
right ahead.
And you mentioned that you saw an overlap between lovers of opera and lovers of baseball.
Mhm.
And I wondered why you think that is. I agree with you, and I wonder why you think that
Well,
is.
many years, people know that I write for WQXR, which is the classical music station here in New York. And one of my first articles many, many years ago was called Take Me Out to the Opera, based on Take Me Out to the Ball Game.
Mhm.
And I have a very, I think, evolved notion about this. Number one, people who love opera are not on a time clock. And most sports, whether it's basketball, soccer, football, hockey, are on a clock. Even races are on clocks. There's no clock in baseball. The only clock is the number of innings that the team plays, and those are 9 for the visiting team and the home team. So every game plays out like a drama. It has its own narrative. It has its own, baseball has its own language that's very distinct. Baseball is something that is handed down from parent to child. You take a child, you go to not the stadium, but you go to the ballpark. And some of the baseball places are called fields or even gardens. We had gardens in New York where baseball played. It's very pastoral. There is the sense that everyone for a moment becomes a protagonist, sings a solo, whether it's the pitcher, whether it's the batter, and each person has their moment, but then the team, like the chorus, participates in a way that supports the soloist. There is great drama in baseball. Baseball requires engagement. Other people who don't get baseball don't understand the degree to which one has to engage, to strategize, to follow what's going on, to pay close attention, to find it very rewarding. And all of that is opera too.
You said it was a very evolved perspective, and that is impressive.
Well, I
Those
really,
reasons.
and also here in New York, we have good baseball teams. And I've noticed that many people who attend the Metropolitan Opera, the opera season begins here in late September and ends May to early June, typically. And the baseball season starts in early April and ends officially in October. But if we are in the World Series, we play into late October, even November. And therefore, there's an overlap. And another city like this is San Francisco, where I've been to the San Francisco Opera, and they do broadcast at the stadium, at the baseball stadium, at AT&T Field, I think it's still called. And one time I was at San Francisco Opera, and they were in the World Series against, I think, Oakland, across the bay. And on the projected title screen above, Joyce DiDonato was singing. I forget the opera, but I remember it was Joyce. And above, they broadcast the scores of the baseball game because people wanted to know. When I worked at the Metropolitan Opera, pre-projected titles, I remember that people would come in with little earpieces watching the opera, but following the ball game if the Yankees were in the World Series, or the Mets less frequently. And the other thing is that you acquire an incredible sense of fan relationship. It's family. If you feel family about your opera company, you tend to recognize the people in the chorus, and you see them, and there they are again. And oh, tonight she's wearing a gown, and tomorrow night she'll be dressed as a warrior, whatever you see. The next night as a prostitute, whatever. We know these faces, we know these people, we recognize them as friends, just as we recognize as friends not just the players in the ball game, but the people at the stadium who work in the stadium. If we sit in our same seats, we become subscribers. We know our seatmates around us. We form communities there in the same way that we form communities as audience members in the opera house. But what I was going to say was that many people, when early baseball season in April would be late-ish at the Metropolitan Opera season, they would go to afternoon games and come to an evening at the opera. In the summer, they would go to baseball while the opera was away. And then when September came, they would start doing both and organizing their schedules. And I knew many people who would arrive at the Metropolitan Opera House directly from the baseball stadium, whether it was Yankee Stadium or then called Shea Stadium, now Citi Field for the New York Mets. And it's the passion, but it's also the intellectual engagement that makes it different from basketball, for example, which is very dramatic. And I know the University of Cincinnati has an amazing basketball team, but they're dramatic in different ways. They're dramatic for the speed. Baseball and opera are dramatic for the degree to which we deeply connect emotionally.
To your point about a double header, if you will. In fact, yesterday I was at the ball game. It was a 12:35 game, and then at Bohème last night. So exactly to your point. I'll just say they were playing the Dodgers.
Okay.
So it was not exactly a fair matchup, but
the Reds are having a rough season.
Let's just say it was a beautiful day. So
it was a beautiful, but that's the other thing. That we're out in the, football is often done in the winter and basketball is done enclosed. Baseball is pastoral.
Yeah.
And, in some stadiums, not New York, but in some stadiums, there's very good food.
We frequently,
Baltimore.
It won't surprise you to know that we frequently have some of our singers go and sing the national anthem or the God Bless America during the seventh innings stretch. And so those are great traditions.
And similarly in New York, there was a wonderful baritone, Robert Merrill, who practically his second job was singing at the Yankee games. And then he would come in to sing Rigoletto at the Met.
Would he only sing for the Yankees or would he ever go over to Brooklyn?
Well, no, at that time it was the Dodgers or the New York Giants who fled to California. But no, he was a Yankee fan.
Yeah.
At that time, we had 3 teams in New York City, which is remarkable.
I might add one other thing to the list of these similarities, which is that I find that as much as you give to either baseball or opera, it gives you back that much and more. And so the deeper you go, the more you invest yourself in the history of the activity or of the participants and the stars, the more you get out of it, and therefore the more you have in common with your fellow fans too. It really is remarkable.
I would add something that I hadn't quite fastened on before. You and I can talk about opera singers from the 1920s. We were not alive in the 1920s, and yet we know what they did. We can hear recordings of them. We know their traditions. We know their impact on the singers who came after. Similarly, we can talk about baseball players from long ago on teams that we didn't even root for. I can tell you about the 1930s St. Louis Cardinals because they were a famous team with very good players, very influential players who changed the style of the game. And I have never been to St. Louis. And nonetheless, I know about the St. Louis Cardinals. I never heard Enrico Caruso or Rosa Ponzell, and yet I can talk about them because of their legacy. And it's true. I don't see people with basketball and maybe soccer, they talk about Pelé from the past, but not to the same degree that people who are deep into baseball and deep into opera talk about them with such engagement and awareness that we are here on the shoulders of those who came before us.
Yes. Last night, I'll mention something about the Bohème. I think you probably know Robert Lombardo, the artist agent. He was one of his artists is singing with us, and I was chatting with him during intermission, and we were just talking about George London, the amazing bass baritone. And exactly to your point. I never saw him live, but I certainly know the recordings and the voice. And More like that, please. That
Well,
was
since
amazing.
we're talking about George London, I hadn't planned
Yeah.
to. Today is June 24th of 2022, and people may not know that his wife, Nora London, died yesterday. I don't know if you knew that.
Just learned that. Yeah.
And Nora London was 98, and she
98.
was a hugely important figure in opera. Maybe let's pay a little tribute to her. Because George London died relatively young and rather suddenly, he was a brilliant singer. She continued his tradition of teaching, of funding young artists, of creating the George London competition that was held every year in New York at the Morgan Library. I know George London was Canadian. I believe she was too, and she loved the French language and loved opera in French and supported French cultural causes. And she's one of those people, if you asked any opera singer in America, and not only, about Nora London, they will be able to tell stories about her and the degree to which she very quietly, very modestly, without attracting attention to herself, but always made it possible for young opera singers who needed an introduction, who needed a door opened, who needed someone like me to talk through a role with them if they were trying to figure out how to approach a character. She would call up and say, can you talk to so-and-so about this role? And I always did. And opera exists also for these people. It's like the scouts in baseball, who find the great talent in places you would never know and bring the talent forth to the attention of the team. Nora London did that with opera singers.
Yes, I've always treasured that part of opera training and opera culture, that kind of mentoring element, showing the way for people. We never know where the next great singer is going to come from. They may be from a family or a community that doesn't have any familiarity with the art form, and there are always these showing the way kind of moments and guides that make the difference for so many singers. I'm glad to hear that about Nora London. I wasn't aware of that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I was hardly unique in being someone she would just call up and say, can you help? And I always did, but she did that with many, many people in our community who could be helpful. And we just did it because Nora London asked her to do it. And that was a pleasure and an honor to be able to do that.
Yes.
So anyway, I didn't know that she was going to come up, but I'm glad that she did. Now I want to go back to Cincinnati and its opera company. As I mentioned earlier, it was founded in 1920, making it the second oldest company after the Met, founded in 1883. Obviously, there was opera in North America before then. We know that it was in New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, and New York City in the 1760s and 70s, and it grew all over the country. Chicago, notably, always had a lot of opera, but they couldn't keep a company going. And the Lyric Opera of Chicago was not born until November 1st, 1954. So relatively, it's younger than companies like Cincinnati, Miami, Milwaukee, San Francisco being the third oldest, 1923. And Los Angeles didn't have a company until 1984, which is also remarkable, but that's for a different discussion. But the fact that Cincinnati, then the sixth largest city in America, created an opera company, it did so very intelligently after the end of the Metropolitan Opera season. And what happened was the Met, leaving New York then in March, would go on national tour to 8 or 9 different cities, went to Cleveland, Ohio, in the northern part of the state, but never came to, I think it came once in 1883, but never came again. And that inspired the city fathers and mothers of Cincinnati to create their own opera company. By setting it in late spring, early summer, all the singers who then finished their obligations to the Metropolitan Opera suddenly wanted work. And Cincinnati said, well, you all can come here to Cincinnati. So remarkably, your city had many of the great singers who appeared at the Met then come to Cincinnati and do a season, a residence of a few weeks in Cincinnati. And it feels like a festival. I don't know if it was intended to be a festival, but it has come to feel like a festival. Has that been part of your planning? And I would also add the people who came before you, such as Patricia Beggs, Nick Muni, Jim DeBlaze, and other people before that. Was that part of the intention, or did it just acquire that festival feeling?
I think it was part of the intention. Think about the history of the organization. I think about the civic-minded nature of our community. And I think of particularly three institutions that existed in 1920, and in fact in 1919 for the first sort of trial season when that happened. And those institutions are, we've mentioned, I guess, one of them, which is the CSO, the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, which was going strong at that point, but its musicians did not have a year-round contract. And so there were layoffs that happened in the summer months. And well, what a shame that we don't offer something during the summer months. What can we do? The other institution is now known as CCM, here locally at least, the Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, which is part of the University of Cincinnati, but then was the Conservatory of Music. And then the last is the Cincinnati Zoo, which is the, I think, most distinctive element of our history. And so a group of Cincinnati's leaders, and as it happens, they were women leaders at that point, who pulled together this idea and tapped Ralph Lyford, who was leading the opera program, who was newly appointed to lead the opera program at the conservatory, to develop this idea of an opera season, how about we have an opera company? Well, Cincinnati as a city developed, as cities do, right on the banks of the river. And you mentioned, Fred, the 7 hills. Don't count them because it's not literally true, but it's metaphorically true, that the city is in a basin and there are hills around the city. And back when there was significant industry downtown, manufacturing, then it was hot and humid, and also the air quality, I'm sure, was very poor in the early 1900s. And so folks would prefer to go to the, as Charles Parsons, the longtime historian who died about 5 years ago, yes, and a friend of yours too, used to say the cooler climes of Mount Auburn or what have you. And the zoo was located just outside the city. And the proper name is the Cincinnati Zoo and Botanical Gardens. And you can go to the zoo, even still today, and enjoy the botanical gardens just as much as you can the zoological part. And so in that era, there was a bandstand. There was a tradition of orchestra and big band kind of performances outdoors in the summer months. And so it was seen as a natural location to start an opera company, an opera festival in the summer months, offering employment to the CSO musicians, offering an opportunity for this new opera leader in Ralph Lyford to do something outside of the school year, maybe even involving students at the time. And then why not at the zoo? And so it sounds strange to say, but for the first 50 years of the company's existence, from 1920 all the way up until 1971, Cincinnati Opera's performances took place at the Cincinnati Zoo in what was initially, I think, more of a bandstand that progressed eventually into a proper outdoor amphitheater with a covered roof, open sides. I think of it, the two references I have in mind when I think of it are Santa Fe Opera. There are some echoes of that structure. And then also the Chautauqua Festival Theater, where there are opera performances as well. And that tradition just lasted, and it became really, especially in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, really legendary singers. And some among our audience proudly still share that they I met a gentleman last night who said he ushered at the zoo, and he would usher at the zoo and then go down to the Cincinnati Enquirer, pick up the papers for his paper route, and then be home by, I don't know, 2 a.m. or something like that. But it became very much a Cincinnati institution in those years. By virtue of the fact that it was outside and at the zoo, it meant that it was much more casual than a European country house opera kind of experience, an outdoor
like Glyndebourne
experience.
or Garsington. Yeah.
Yes. Families would go. There would be intermission activities and features, including, strangely enough, ice skating in the summer months. And you could take a long intermission, stroll about the grounds, and get some treats and visit with friends. It was much more casual. Also, because you're at the zoo, it meant that sometimes animals are inspired to make noises, and we understand that particularly loud. You would think that it would be elephants and lions that would make the most noise, but it was the chimps and also the peacocks who were the loudest. And I believe there is a recording from a late 1960s of a late 1960s Carmen. I think Mignon Dunn is on that recording, where you can hear the peacocks screeching as the singers try to proceed with it, which created, I think, a mood of levity, where opera can sometimes take itself a little too seriously. Because it wasn't funny just for the audience. It was sometimes funny for the singers as well on stage.
Beverly Sills told me that she liked singing to the animals and wondering were they going to respond to her voice. Because she had a very high, and I'll describe it as metallic voice. That's not a negative judgment, but it had a certain steel to it that could probably raise the ears of certain animals.
She was one of the artists who actually sang on either side of the company's history. So she did a number of performances at the zoo in 66, 7, and 8, and then also performed in music hall too, when we made the transition in 1972.
And that was really my question. What prompted the transition to music hall?
I think that certainly one of the factors was comfort of the audience. Music hall was air conditioned, and I think there was also an aspiration to be more theatrically advanced, and there was new leadership at the time, and then there was significant philanthropy from the Corbetts as well, who were interested in underwriting a reimagining, if you will, of the opera experience and what it could be. And in those days, in fact, there was an early partnership with New York City Opera. I would point to a famous production of Mephistopheles. In fact, it was the first Cincinnati opera production at Music Hall in 1972 that reopened the hall after renovations to convert it from what at that point would have been mostly a concert venue for the CSO into a place for theatrical presentations, opera presentations, which we still hear people talk about that performance and how legendary it was. It was the Norman Treagle.
Norman Treagle, yeah.
Yeah.
Recently, Samuel Ramey was my guest, and Sam Ramey inherited a lot of the Norman Treagle roles and productions. He too, Treagle died unfortunately quite young, and therefore Sam was the natural heir and knew every one of those roles perfectly. It was interesting. He
likely did that production, don't you think?
He did. I saw him do it. Absolutely.
You saw him do that production, yeah.
Yeah. But the question I was going to ask you about the zoo, but it leads into music hall, is in terms of production values, which is to say scenery, costumes, lighting, stage direction, and so on, was anything at the zoo notably good dramatically? And by that, I don't mean the singers, but I mean the productions, or was that another thing that occasioned the desire to move to indoors?
I think my sense of things is that it was it wasn't about that so much. It was about star singers and the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra, and traditional repertoire. Occasionally there were attempts to elevate the theatrical presentation, but I think that was met with mixed success. It was a very small stage, and it was there wasn't much of a house or a structure above the stage, so really quite challenging to create much in the way of effects. Not to mention the fact that sunset in the summer here is not till as late as 9:15 or even 9:25 or something like that. So you have that challenge as well.
It's interesting in Verona, in Italy. Sorry to interrupt. In Verona, they don't start till the sun goes down.
There you go.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The stories that I hear, what people treasure is the individual artist performances that they saw Placido Domingo in 1966. They saw Shirley Verrett in Samson or whatever.
Caballé.
Yeah, these legendary names, Robert Merrill among them. We mentioned him earlier, and that was I think the appeal of the performances in those days. There were occasional forays into newer works. Of Mice and Men was performed fairly early at the zoo. L'amore dei tre re was
Montemezzi,
who conducted, I believe, at the zoo.
Really? Wow.
Yeah.
But
I've seen.
Yes, go ahead.
I was just going to share that there was in. So let's see. The company founded in 1920. So this would have been 1970. There was a 50th anniversary video made. I'm happy to send you a link if you want to share it. But there was a video made by a local television station, WLWT, noting here we are at the zoo for Cincinnati Opera's 50th season. And there are interviews with some of you mentioned Jim DeBlaise, the general director at the time, and then a number of other folks, including the soprano who was singing Tosca that night. And that gives a little bit of a sense of the venue and of the experience. But it was, in some ways, I think, yes, we had the star singers come in. Yes, we had the CSO. But in some ways, it was such a community event as well. And I know that a lot of arts organizations, particularly those of a European traditional kind of heritage, are really reflecting on what does it mean to be part of our community and produce for our community. And there are some important clues, I think, in our history of that point to accessibility and being welcoming and all those things that make it possible for folks of all backgrounds to attend our performances.
Well, I would note in looking back through your annals that were compiled, by the way, by Charles Parsons. Charles died a few years ago. He was an historian. He was an opera lover. I don't know if he was a baseball lover. I never spoke to him about that. He was the critic for Opera News who wrote about the Cincinnati season. And he straddled that line between being a negative reviewer on occasion, but a passionate supporter of Cincinnati Opera and of the community. And he was very dedicated and therefore created these annals. There were many Black artists who appeared sooner in Cincinnati than in many other theaters, perhaps because of its particular relationship on the river and being the place where Black people from the South came and found freedom or relative freedom in Cincinnati compared to the South. And that to me was a very important element of the company's makeup going back many, many years, whereas sadly, many other opera companies were way too late in including Black artists in their role, in major roles in their theaters. But I want to go back to music hall and productions. It was designed as a symphonic hall. It was not, to my knowledge, designed as a theater where scenery, costumes, and lighting could be installed and used. How did that work? First, in 1970, I know that you've had to update, the theaters required a lot of adjustments through the years to make it work now.
Yes, that's true. You know, what's fascinating about that is I think it was in 1881, 82, 83, there was an opera festival that took place in Music Hall. And it's so extraordinary, incredible to look back on that history, because it's like Huguenots one night, Aida the next night, and another big opera the night after that. And we struggle to understand how that's even possible.
Pre-unions.
What's that?
It was before labor union movements.
Oh, before.
That's
and I think
part
it
of
was
it,
mostly, it had to be mostly drops, mostly fabric drops that they were using, backdrops that they were using. But so at least in its earliest days, there were stage theatrical performances. I've read reviews of those, and I've not seen any complaints about the acoustics. The sightlines have always been an issue in music hall, especially it's because it's a U-shaped seating, and we know with theaters that are like that you either have an exceptionally broad thrust stage that allows folks to look straight down, or you have challenges with sightlines. Music hall has always had challenges with sightlines, and it's gotten better over the years, and it's a smarter and smarter seating chart, or that the house is. I will say that the last renovation, which was completed in 2017, we thought the acoustics were good before, but they are really extraordinary now, particularly on the piano pianissimo end of things. The house still at forte still, I'll say vibrates, but that's the sense you get. There's a real thrill for big sound in music hall. But now we have the other end as well, for those very quiet moments when Violetta is reading the letter or something like that, where
Teneste la promesa.
Teneste la promesa. And it's really captivating, really extraordinary, beautiful.
So I know that we're going to talk about your current season, but I want to talk specifically about Aida. I should say in full disclosure that you asked me to write the program notes for this particular production, but that's not why I'm raising it. I'm raising it because you're talking about the theater vibrating. And Aida has a big sound. You have artists who have big sounds who are going to be there.
Yes.
It's kind of like you're picking the four strongest home run hitters in your baseball team, all in the lineup. And what will it sound like when you have a huge chorus, a huge orchestra, Gregory Kundi, Morris Robinson, Tashina Vaughn, Mary Elizabeth Williams, and so on? That's roof rattling.
One of my very favorite memories of my time at Cincinnati Opera, and I've been with the company since 97, and then was actually an intern in 89 and 90, occurred in, I think it was the 2013 season. Patty Beggs, who was the general director just prior to me, she's general director emerita, thank you very much. And she's not only a good friend, but such an advocate still for the arts in our community and for the art form nationally. She and I were standing behind the last row, which was possible before the most recent renovation, the last row of the orchestra level. And we were watching the triumphal scene of Aida, and it was as many as 100 people on stage. I will say, and similar voices, similar quality of voices to what you mentioned for the 2022 cast. Our chorus, I think it's something like 2/3 of them, maybe a little bit more, have a relationship with the College Conservatory of Music one way or another. And CCM draws nationally and internationally amazing talent. And I always think that, gosh, any one of these chorus members could have a significant career in opera. So you have amazing internationally renowned soloists and our chorus, and the Cincinnati Symphony Orchestra. And I just remember Patty and I kind of turned to each other after that and said, this is what it's all about. We work all year long for an amazing moment like this. And so the sound, it will be enveloping. If you're the kind of person who gets chills or goosebumps, you will experience that. And it's followed by a sound that is just as thrilling, which is the reaction of the audience. And here in Cincinnati, our audience is very vocal. So there will be whooping, there will be some bravos and some very sophisticated types who will say bravi. And it is, there's a moment, of course, in the triumphal scene where it's not over, but it seems like it's over, or at least there's a musical exclamation point. And it's so thrilling and so affirming for those of us who work for the company and in the art form to see that, yes, it still has this, this opera, this art form still has this ability to grab us and inspire us and really take us take us out of ourselves for just a moment. And
what I'd like to talk, yes, go ahead, sorry.
And I'll just add that, and once you have that experience, may every person who goes to opera have that experience, first of all. But once you have it, you must have it again. And so, gosh, I just hope that for every opera goer that they don't see a mediocre Barber of Seville and say, not for me.
Well, I'm an opera evangelist, and I've spent much of my life trying to get people to love opera, not just to appreciate opera. And I meet people and, they'll say, well, I don't like opera. Well, how many have you seen? Well, I went when I was 17 or 11 or 25. And what did you see? I don't remember. And, well, how many operas have you seen? Well, just that one. And I say, well, if you go to cinema, and you see a movie you don't like, you don't stop going to the movies. If you read books and there's a book you don't like, you don't stop reading books. Same with theater, same with Japanese or Italian or any cuisine of the world food. Yes. You keep trying. And yet they think opera is just not for them, whereas you and I know that opera is completely for them and is the most relevant art form of all, and the one that can inspire the most passion of any, frankly, which is part of why we love it, which does lead me to your current season that I wanted to talk to you about, because I think it's very emblematic of the current state of your company. And we should mention that you have a wonderful colleague, Evans Mirages, who was on this program about 2 years ago. He and I are old friends. You're artistic director, but much more than artistic director. He has remarkable taste and an awareness of audience and knowledge of who the next good singer is, but also using older singers who might be really right for a role that, frankly, other companies ignore because they're on the other side of 50. And so that I know that you, as general director and CEO, along with Evans Mirages, create these seasons and do the planning and do the thinking. Talk about your current season, which just began with Bohème, and you have more coming up, because I think it's a fascinating mix that you've created of the very traditional, like Bohème and Aida, and operas that are just not well known, and frankly 2 world premieres, which is fantastic too.
So we've said a couple of times that Cincinnati Opera started in 1920, and so if one does the math, then that means 2020 would be the 100th anniversary season. And Fred, I think you were planning to come for that. It was 100 years, and we had so much planned in the way of both main stage performances and then also a number of special events, special activities, and community activities as well too. I started officially on March 1st, 2020, and the first big decision, which in retrospect was like, well, how much of a difficult decision was that. But the first big decision was resulted in my recommending to the board that we cancel the entire season, the entire 2020 season.
Mm.
And at the time, we said, we're committed to presenting as much of that season as we can at some point. And the 2020 season was to include 2 new works. It was to include Castor and Patience, new opera by Tracy Smith and Greg Spears, and then also Fierce, new opera by William Menefield and Sheila Williams, 2 local artists who live and work in our community. And we knew when we got past the 2020 season, and we, like every other company, started to ask ourselves the question of what does coming back look like, that we needed to be in a proper theater for these 2 works, that we didn't want to do some kind of outdoor concert version of either of these, but that each was worthy of a proper premiere. And so we would delay those until that would be possible. And so it happens that those land finally in the 2022 season. Our conversation with Greg Spears goes back to 2016 when he was here for his fellow travelers.
About which I want to talk to you later.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Patty and Evans went to lunch with Greg, and the communication, which I had a heads up about, was whatever the next project is, we're interested. So Greg shared that he had this project in mind, and we're so thankful to be finally presenting that this summer. I will tell you that I have heard some of the rehearsals for that, and not only is it a very compelling story, but it is also Greg Spears's music, and that is something to really to sit up and listen to. He as I like to think about it, and I don't want to push this idea too far, but he is a composer who cares about whether he's connecting with the audience. And I guess I do mean to imply that not all composers are like that, but for Greg, he wants to connect, and he does connect. And this has a completely different color. We think of, you and I have talked before about Verdi and his tinta for each of his operas. This has a different color than Fellow Travelers does, but so appealing. And I, a few days ago, was up in the break room, which is right next to one of the rehearsal areas. And I just heard one of our coach accompanists working with a singer, and I immediately recognized that's Greg Spears's music. And I haven't heard that. And that's, oh my gosh, that's so beautiful. So really very excited about that. That and Fierce has its own origin story as well. And this was inspired by, frankly, the stories of young women here in Cincinnati. And so our librettist met with a number of young women, high school age students, and heard from them what their challenges are in this world, whether that has to do with bullying on social media or difficult home life, or challenges with the boyfriend, or whatever the issues are. And the beautiful thing is how the opera ends, and it ends with a message of, I'll say triumph, but it's about unity. It's about sharing burdens, and ultimately the title is Fierce, right? Which we understand to mean something having to do with courage and triumph over struggle, and facing down these in the opera. There are trolls who embody some of these challenges in life. Ultimately a message for all of us, but it happens that this is about the stories in a composite kind of way of Cincinnati young women. Very excited about that as well.
So I have a question about that regarding the casting, because I don't know who's in it. If it premieres, by the way, on July 6th for people who will be near or in Cincinnati. I wish I could be. When you have an opera that is about teenagers, often you have either mezzo sopranos or in some way voices that evoke being a teenager. We're not talking about Madame Butterfly or Salome; those are other kinds of teenagers, but girls who might be familiar to people on the streets of Cincinnati, in the schools and in the museums and the restaurants and the zoo and the opera house. How do you vocally cast teenage girls in an opera like that? Or how did you?
I'll tell you this. 2 nights ago, we were at Allen Temple AME Church, and the program featured Evans, our artistic director, and for me, the best colleague I could ever hope for, interviewing the creative teams for both Castor and Patience and Fierce. And then it was followed by an excerpt, a musical performance from Fierce. And so we saw the singers who will be performing the role of the 4 young women who are the centerpiece of this production. And all I can say is that it works, and it works beautifully. I think there's 2 mezzos and 2 sopranos in terms of voice type, and I was amazed by it. The composer, William Menefield, has both has a dual track background. One is the traditional classical composition education, and the other is he is an extraordinary jazz musician. And many people in Cincinnati know, oh, William, I heard him play at this event, and he is a jazz pianist, and that comes through very much so in the music. It works, and I think that if there are moments where it's like, well, I don't know that is what a teenager would sound like. It is the lyrics transcend and connect. Nevertheless, I was surprisingly moved by it. I will share that I have 3 daughters, and so if this is the story of young women, I have some experience there, and it was quite moving actually to see them struggle and then find help in each other. It was beautiful.
And then you have Pirates of Penzance by Gilbert and Sullivan, one of those cases where the librettist name comes before the composer's name. That's unusual. Although in Italy in the 19th century, they used to say Rigoletto di Francesco Piave, musica di Giuseppe Verdi. But Piave came first, even for the great Verdi. But Pirates of Penzance, which requires a different kind of style, it requires a lot of physical dexterity, a lot of fast movement of speech. Patrick Harfizzi is the major general, the very model of a modern major general, one of the hardest things to say. You have a wonderful cast. I'm glad, by the way, to see Amber Wagner as Ruth. I think it's not a secret that when the pandemic came, she just stopped for a long time, and I was concerned that we were not going to see her back on our stages again. I'm very happy because she's a marvelous, marvelous singer.
Yes.
And,
I'm excited too. I think you and I both saw her in Tannhäuser in Chicago.
In Chicago,
Unbelievable performance. That was so fantastic. And this is her first time singing with us. And yes, she's singing the role of Ruth. And I believe conversations are underway about maybe other things in the future as well too.
Good.
That's very exciting. So I should say that we perform in 2 venues in Cincinnati. We have the music hall titles, which are the music hall, the venue we've been talking about, features Springer Auditorium and Springer seats, I think about 2,400 now. It's fluctuated based on the renovations. And that's where we have La Boheme, the current production, and we'll have the Pirates of Penzance. And then after that, we'll close the season in music hall with Aida. The two new operas take place in the School for Creative and Performing Arts, which is just down the street and actually a passion project of the late Eric Kunzel, who wanted to make the connection between the working musicians and artists that are here in music hall and saw to it in many ways that the school was moved to just essentially 2 blocks away from Music Hall. And so we are all the time walking up Elm Street to get to the School for Creative and Performing Arts, and that's where that's a 700 seat venue, appropriate for a more intimate experience for those 2 other titles, Castor Patience and Fierce. But yes, so Pirates is interesting for us. We have not done a Gilbert and Sullivan opera in a long, long time. I think it goes back to the early 1980s or something like that. But as we've discussed it, planning for the season, we just felt like we often find ourselves saying, gosh, it'd be great to have a comedy. That's one of the recurring lines that always happens in season planning conversations. And so at some point we said, well, what if, right? What if we tried one of the GNS operas? And so we end up with this production, which actually comes to us from our friends. I think it originated in St. Louis, and Sean Curran is the director.
Mhm.
And they actually, I think, they are in the midst of the room run right now.
Okay.
And that started at 2:00. So that team is, they're having such a great time. And it is, I mean, the thing that I often forget about Gilbert and Sullivan, it is that it is absurdly silly. It is just silly, silly, silly. And we've decided to cast with like real opera singers. So this is some really very fine casting, and we're
Zachary
eager to.
James is the Pirate King.
Yes,
That's
fresh
kind of
from
remarkable.
Akhenaten at the Met. Yes.
He
We're
was
pleased to welcome him.
the father of Akhenaten and other characters in Akhenaten recently here at the Met. That
Indeed.
could not be more of a leap from that to the Pirate King. Yeah. No, it's a wonderful cast
Yes.
up and down. I looked at it.
Yes.
And therefore, you also, one more thing I want to add about this season before we go back to Fellow Travelers, is Morris Robinson and Friends. Morris being a wonderful bass. I can't go down that low, but wonderful bass, and important figure in the opera world as well. Would you talk about that and him?
Morris first appeared with us in 2009, I think it was, and it was actually in a performance of Don Carlo. He was
Inquisitor.
The Grand Inquisitor, and James Morris, who is one of the great, he got his start in Cincinnati, and I think he may have sung at the zoo early in his career, but certainly by the early 70s, he was regularly singing with us. So it was the 2 of them on stage for the one scene in Don Carlo, really amazing. Morris sang then in the 2010 season. He's been back a number of times, and then starting, I think about 3 years ago, we asked him if he'd be willing to serve as an artistic advisor for us. And that has been nothing but excellent. He not only has such great and kind of breakthrough ideas, some of which, most of which we're not ready to talk about yet. But Morris is a great colleague, friend, artist, and we're so always pleased to have him on stage. He was in the last production we did prior to Bohème, which was our summer of 2019 production of Porgy and Bess. So we're pleased to have him back for Aida, and a dream that he has had for a number of years, which may have been partly inspired by a program that we've done for, I think, almost 15 years now, called Opera Goes to Church, wherein we partner with a church that has a significant music program and provide some of our singers, some of our artists to do solo performances and also perform with the choirs sometimes as well, for what is an extraordinary musical extravaganza. There's always such joy in those performances, and sometimes it's church music, and sometimes it's gospel music, and sometimes it's a lot of opera, and then also maybe even a Tonight from West Side Story or something like that. Thrilling music, audience on their feet kind of experiences. We learned through that program and Morris's participation in it that not only did Morris have a background singing in church, but he also would occasionally play the drums in church. So I mentioned that Morris was in our Porgy and Bess production, and Morris has been with us a number of years, and for several of those years has participated in this Opera Goes to Church program. And in some of those occasions, he has played drums. Well, it happened after a performance of Porgy and Bess, after one of the performances, that it was overheard that one patron said to another with a straight face, "Wow, that drummer from Allen Temple AME Church can really sing." Which we thought was great, you know, however you get there is just fine. So Morris's dream has long been to find a way to offer the two sides of his musical life. And one side is he's an opera singer, and his rep runs the gamut, right? And then the other side is gospel music and church music. And so an evening with Morris and Friends, the Morris and Friends program features Morris and a number of his friends. And I have to mention Lawrence Brownlee, as part of the program as well. We understand that Larry also plays bass, which we may get to.
Indeed. Larry and I explored gospel music 10 years ago, and he knows his stuff. He's an Ohioan as well, right? I think so.
Yes, I think at least he went to school in Ohio, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was with us, but much too long ago. So we're excited to have him back with the company, at least for that night, and looking forward to something else down the road at some point too. So that will be that. I think it's July the 27th, in between Aida performances, a number of folks coming in to perform on that program. It will be an electric night in music hall, so like maybe partly on the set of Aida, but you know, we're going to figure out how to make it work, and it'll be extraordinary. An outgrowth, if you will, of our Opera Goes to Church program. So it's Opera Goes to Church goes to music hall. Is
you and I have danced around a topic in our conversation, not that we planned to, but it just came up. You and I and people who do what we do are often in the position of being friends with singers or colleagues of singers and having ideas for good work that they might want to do. Now, someone like Evans Mirageous is a master at this.
Indeed.
But you mentioned Larry Brownlee had an idea for a role that I think he'd be wonderful at. And I dropped it in his ear about 18 months ago. And it doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but you just mentioned Amber Wagner and how you're talking to her about future things. A lot of working in opera is not only remembering the past, but thinking about the future and trying to imagine where a voice might go, where the personality of a singer might fit with a role that maybe they didn't think of. I've had it happen with singers and conductors, actually, where I would put something in their ear and sometimes they would say, yeah, that's great. Other times they would say, never. And usually it's somewhere in between. And there's a conductor friend of mine, and in one case I put something in his ear, he rejected it, but then he took it on and got great acclaim for it and was wonderful at it. And I put another idea in his ear. It's been 10 years and I've said to him, so how do you feel about that opera? Well, I'll get around to it. But you know, part of it's like baseball. It's like imagining which team would work together, which singer might fit a role. And with Larry Brownlee, I'll send you an email with the role I had in mind for him. I think he would be great at it. And I think it's something that no one would approach him for. But anyway.
I'm intrigued.
But how do you do that thought process about singers we like, who we want to have a long-going relationship with, in terms of not having them come back to do their familiar parts, but to give them something special, new?
For me, it's one of the, I can't turn it off. So when I'm watching a performance, if I'm watching them do one role, I'm always thinking about oh, that particular phrase or that particular sustained top note suggests somehow that they could do this, that they could do that. And the most fulfilling musings, I guess, or discoveries somehow is when it's an artist who just never does comic opera, and you think, what, there is a perfect spot in this particular role, or an artist that sometimes voices go in unexpected directions. You hear them 2-3 seasons ago, compared to, you hear them in 2015, and then you hear them again in 2018, and it's an unexpected development in the voice, and you realize what that could really go to a heroic role. They could, that is a Lady Macbeth, if I have ever heard one. And sometimes they know that, or their manager knows that, and sometimes they don't. And it's, I find it so fulfilling also to just have those conversations with those artists. I find that most artists nowadays really are generally getting good advice. They are trained, I think, to listen and to be, they want to sing for 30 years. And so they're careful and they're thoughtful, and they appreciate the perspective, insight, ideas, even if we only get to see, 1 in 10 of those things actually happen. But, I think that most delightful is when you discover something new about an artist and see that come to fruition. Post-performance, I often asked audience members who they make a comment about, oh, the soprano was so amazing. I might say, what would you like to hear them in next? And sometimes there are surprising results there, and that's always intriguing as well. Oh, you heard that in the voice. Why did you hear that? Oh, well, the moment where this happens. So there are clues all the time in performances where we get to imagine they could do that role. There just might be an ability there that they haven't tapped into yet.
That a lot of my early training came from artist Kranick, who was the general director of the Lyric Opera Chicago. And she was a person of very strong opinions, to put it mildly. She was very rational. She was very focused on finances always, and I admired her for that. She knew her audiences. She knew what she liked. She also knew that she had to provide things that she didn't like because her audience wanted it. And she and I once, this is 35 years ago, we're talking about one of the great sopranos of 35 years ago, who had a very long run at the Lyric Opera Chicago. I should just say it's not Catherine Malfitano, who also had a very long run at the Lyric Opera of Chicago, but with a very different relationship to the company than the soprano I'm talking about. The soprano I'm talking about was a huge star in Europe, worked a lot with Herbert von Karajan, some at the Met, but more in Chicago. And she had her group of roles that she did. And artists said that once a singer has gone through her roles in Chicago, that's it. She said, I'm not bringing her back to do her Violetta or her Aida again, because we've seen that. I don't envision her in anything else because she does her roles incredibly well. The Marshal and the roles that she did incredibly well, among the best, but there weren't that many. And she could take those roles anywhere and people wanted to see her. But artists said, she's not coming back to Chicago. I said, but this is such a wonderful artist, singer, maybe we can have her come do something new. She won't do it. She won't be engaged. I mean, she would agree to do it, but she wouldn't have that emotional attachment, because if she did Rosenkavalier and Aida with Herbert von Karajan, as she did, that set the template for her performance. And in the later stages, which is to say 52 years old of the soprano's career, she was not going to have a conductor, even James Levine at that time, create something new with her. Levine did Ariadne with her once. These roles require a certain kind of physical and sonic presence on the stage. The soprano did incredibly well, but artist Kranick said she'll never do anything new for us. Kathy Malfitano is always up for the next challenge.
For sure.
That's why Malfitano had a much longer career in Chicago than this other, I know you'll figure out who it is, soprano, big, huge star in Europe, especially. All the great opera companies of Europe, Salzburg Festival constantly, huge star. But she sang at the Met some, but a lot in Chicago.
Once she did the role she does, that was it.
Artist said she's not coming back.
Huh.
And that definitively, there was no room for my discussing it with artist Kranick.
You'll have to go elsewhere to see her.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
I mean, and I did, because it was a very inspiring artist. Karajan loved her. And, Karajan could pick any singer in the world, and this is one that he loved.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I want to go back to Fellow Travelers.
Yeah.
And preface it by saying that it was a remarkable experience, that opera. It has traveled to many, many places. You had me out to lecture before it and Fidelio, where you had the wonderful casting of Christine Goerke and Russell Thomas.
Wonderful.
In what is still the best Fidelio production I've ever seen. I don't remember who staged it. If you could remind me, if you know.
I think it was Chris Alexander.
Yeah, it was a fantastic production of Fidelio. I remember so well that it was updated somewhat the way many Fidelio productions are, in which everybody at the end is typically reunited with their loved ones left out of prison. But in this production, no, there were women looking for their men who did not come out. Mm-hmm. And that was so gripping and frankly, very, very realistic. And it didn't have the uniformly happy ending for everybody but Marcellina in that opera. And it was so much more gripping because suddenly you realized, no, these horrible political things that are done to political prisoners and people who are different in one way or another have consequences. And that production, without underlining it, made it incredibly clear. And Goerke and Russell Thomas were an amazing team together, and that really helped. But I was honored to be asked to speak at those operas because I found connections, real connections, between Fellow Travelers, which you will talk about, and Fidelio, even though technically they're from different times and places. But Fellow Travelers is set in the mid-1950s when Fidelio reopened the Vienna State Opera in 1955 as the opera intended to set the tone for the future. That was what was happening in Vienna after the trauma and horrors of World War II. Whereas in our country, Fellow Travelers, we were a successful, wealthy country and post-war, and yet there was racism, sexism, prejudice, paranoia, communist witch hunts, and so on, which were so, it's kind of like they were a pair, those operas. I don't know if you planned that, you and Evans and Patty Beggs planned it, or there was just a synergy between those two works that seeing them together made it that much more powerful.
Yeah, I think it was a happy discovery, that that pairing between the two. It was the 2016 season. And we were actually out of Music Hall, and Music Hall was under renovation. And so we were at another venue downtown here in Cincinnati, the Aronoff, which offers within or under one roof, both a large theater, 2,700 seats, which is usually where the Broadway performances happen from September to May. And then also a smaller theater that's 400 seats and was actually ideal for Fellow Travelers. Fellow Travelers grew out of a program that we have in collaboration. See, these collaborations, they just continue. We still work with the CSO. They're our orchestra for 102 years, and with the Conservatory of Music, CCM. This partnership called Opera Fusion has us creating or providing an incubator for new operas. And one of those that came along was a project called Fellow Travelers. And we, I think some of us had familiarity with Greg Spears from some of his earlier operas, but the work was new to us. And it was, I think, one of those experiences where we recognized pretty immediately that this is a powerful story, and this is a powerful voice of a new composer. And eventually, of course, it led to our presenting the world premiere of Fellow Travelers in 2016. There is a recording of it available, of course, on Adagio, which is great.
On Adagio, yes.
Yeah, Adagio, yeah. Thank you. And that is from our performances. We have a partnership with WGUC, the 24-hour, we're proud to say, classical music station here in Cincinnati. They record our performances and then they broadcast them. In this case, they recorded and then we produced this, the album version of it. We're pleased to make that, to have that available as an archive, but also then as an active listen for people who don't have a chance to see the performance live. It's been in several places. It's continued to be performed. It's an important project, an important topic, important dramatically as well as socially. So
talk about the story a bit. I could have, but I wanted you to do it.
Yeah. So we've heard of the Red Scare, but there was also the Lavender Scare, and this was the 1950s, as you so accurately painted the picture of what was happening, particularly in the halls of power. There was a great amount of discrimination that was happening against people who were gay, who were transgender, who were different in that way somehow. And that was in that era unacceptable. And so it was pursued in a way that is inhumane. And not only that, but there were, of course, relationships that were not recognized, and there were relationships that were not possible as well, too, though they should have been. And a particularly poignant moment is the musical selection that you and I had spoken about, which is called Our Very Own Home, and it is for the character named Hawk. And there's, I guess I'll say, a misunderstanding that his beloved believes they can have a life together, and can't we just be a couple and have a life together? And Hawk has the painful task of explaining to him through this powerful aria that I'm sorry to say it doesn't really work that way in our world, and so this idea of our very own home is a dream that cannot be. Thankfully, we're in a different place now, although we continue to have concerns about liberty and freedom and equality. That was, for us, we had committed to the project before we knew about the equality in marriage ruling that came from the Supreme Court. And so that happened, I want to say, just a few weeks before the premiere of our work, Fellow Travelers. So it was just, so often we feel like, gosh, this is, sometimes people will say the opera angels are watching over us or something like that, but it was real. There was the synergy with regard to Fidelio and Fellow Travelers that you mentioned, and then there was this life and art interplay with regard to the Supreme Court ruling, and then also this powerful new opera. I'll say that our production ends in a way that is so appropriate and was also so devastating, which is that Timmy in the opera, we see him leaving. We don't know where he's going to go. He needs to find his way in the world, and at least as we understand it right now, he does so alone. And as
the tenor role.
That's the tenor role. Yes.
The Aaron Blake role.
Aaron Blake role.
Yeah,
indeed. Yeah, that's right. And he walks upstage, and then the blackout happens. But as he's walking, there is a projection of historic faces of people who were in so many ways traumatized and victimized and targeted for their sexuality. And it was an extraordinary experience to be in the theater. Very, very moving experience. You and I, Fred, talk often about the ways in which opera delivers and how it changes us as people. And that was one of those experiences. It was really, we could not be more proud to have presented that. It happens that extra bonus, which was excellent, was that there was a lot of media attention around it too.
Mhm.
That's not why we ever do a project. We do a project because we believe in it, either for our community. The ideal is it's right for our community and it's artistically important. But in this case, it just was in so many ways resonant, relevant, and important to.
There are two other things I want to commend about that opera. I could commend many things about it. One was that both of the leading gay characters were white males, but there was nothing monolithic about, quote, being gay, whatever that means. They were very different personalities. One of them came from Fordham University and was a Catholic, a Jesuit, and his approach to his thinking and his morality was very different from the other character. And they were drawn to one another, obviously, but the other character had a certain kind of, for people from the United States would understand this, East Coast ease that he felt entitled to things because he was white and of a certain class and so on. And all of that was so beautifully communicated in the libretto, but also in the music. Mm-hmm. And it created dramatic tension because they were just not gay. They were very complex individuals who happened to be gay.
Yes.
And
in fact, so let's go on a little bit of a journey here. Could you imagine, as I've thought about this opera, one of the hallmarks of a great opera is that there are different ways to portray a character, a couple of characters, or sometimes even the storyline. What makes Violetta ill? What makes Lucia mad? There are different interpretations that can add meaning and color to our experience in seeing it. What I see in Hawk, the more dominant character, the more worldly character,
entitled character,
yeah. Is there you could almost play that as a Don Giovanni kind of, that he is a predator in a way. That wasn't how we portrayed it, but there are qualities to it suggests to me, wow, there is some real depth and artistry behind the formation of the libretto, the characters, the story, that suggests that it can live on well beyond just the original interpretation and the original interpreters. And it leads me to say too, that one of the things that I think, I have a short list of things that make a great opera, right? It's a storyline that the audience can follow. Most of the time, it's a fairly simple linear storyline. It's characters that are multidimensional, that can be interpreted in different ways by different performers. And among the other things, it can make a star of a singer. Mm-hmm. And Fellow Travelers has that quality of, did you see Aaron Blake's performance as Timothy? Did you see Joe Latanzi's performance as Hawkins Fuller, right? And not all works are like that, and certainly not all new operas are like that. But I've often thought that there is an entirely different way to direct this, or to look at a different prism to look at this through. And it suggests to me that there's a dimensionality to Fellow Travelers that
There
doesn't
definitely
exist.
is. I saw a production, I'm blocking where I saw it
Yeah.
elsewhere, and Aaron Blake was the tenor again, but there was a different baritone as Hawk. Maybe you know where it was
Maybe it
co-produced.
was it Chicago?
Washington,
Maybe? I know
Chicago.
Chicago Opera. Lyric did it under their Lyric Unlimited, I think.
I don't think, could it be Washington?
It hasn't been done in Washington
All
yet.
right. Well, it's somewhere. I
It
think
needs to be done in Washington.
it does
Of
need to
all
be done in
places.
Washington. It's set in Washington mostly.
Of
But
course.
no, the reason I mention this is because I agree with you that the baritone character, Aaron Blake is kind of definitive in the role of
Yes.
the tenor, if you've seen him. But the baritone character could be played many, many different ways. And this entitlement, when I first saw it, struck me as just blind naivete about the realities of the world.
Yeah.
That in 1955, with witch hunts and everything that was happening in Washington, you could not survive that. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who was apparently gay, but very cruel to other gay people, had to remain somewhat closeted and took his psychic issues and applied it toward cruelty. But the other character, the tenor, was a lot more realistic. But I've seen Hawk played as being more predatory, which is why he's called Hawk.
After all, right?
After all,
Yeah.
that did not escape me on that. The other thing I wanted to praise about that opera, and I can praise many things about Fellow Travelers, you would think that an opera about two men who are gay, or frankly, let's use the term of the period, homosexual, not gay, that there wouldn't be a great role for a woman, but there is a great role for a woman in that opera. Why does the name Sue stick in my head? Could that be the name of the character? It was the woman who in effect became the protector, the defender, the one with the conscience, who saw what was going on and made great sacrifices
Mary,
on her own.
I think.
Mary, yes, you're right.
Yeah.
And it was a wonderful, complex character, as important as the two men. And without her, the opera would not have had the resonance that it did, at least in my view.
And you said, did you call her voice of conscience? Yeah, agree. Yeah, I think that's just right.
Yeah. But it's not that she would address the audience and say, this is like the stage manager in Thornton Wilder plays, or even some of the characters in Arthur Miller plays, who turn to the audience and narrate the morality issues. She was a character in it, but we in her felt it the way we feel with Leonora and Fidelio, that this powerful moral sense and this indignation of cruelty and the waste of human life and potential. And as I'm saying this, my friend, I want people who are listening to realize this is opera. This is what we talk about.
That's
not
right.
Just baseball and, high notes.
Yeah.
All the opera is a reflection of who we are more powerfully than any art form I can think of. It just is.
I don't know why this comes to mind, but I wanted to share with you the dramaturgical truth that I learned recently, which is, and I'm not going to describe this quite right, but you'll get the idea. So the dramaturgical truth is that if and then I'll give you the example and it'll be clear, is that if a character says, I am sad, it makes us feel not as sad as if they said, I'm okay. I mean, this has happened and this tragedy has happened and this other thing with my health has happened, but I'm okay. That makes us sad. In other words, if the facts lead us to one conclusion, but we don't have the conclusion and we have to draw it in our own heads, it's much more impactful. And I had learned that just from some reading I had been doing. But gosh, I saw that in Bohème when you and I have said again and again in our conversations that we come to Bohème. Bohème may be the same, but we come to it differently every time we see it. And as I watched it again, I'm thinking of the very ending of Bohème, and Mimi dies. Rodolfo's friends recognize that, and they said, I think it's Esperato.
Espirata.
Right?
And what's interesting, the one who says it is Schaunard, who's the most insignificant character of the group of boys and girls, but he's the one who first sees that she's died, and we registered him through. That's a bit of Puccini genius.
Yes, he doesn't say, we're translating it, she's gone. We're not saying she's dead. Puccini or the librettist didn't say e morta.
She's expired.
Yes. And Rodolfo, no one ever says, he never says, you're telling me she's dead, she's dead. He says merely a question, that why are you looking at me like this?
Wait, but before that, sorry to interrupt, pal.
Yeah.
He says, vedi e tranquilla.
Yes.
You see,
look.
She's calm.
Yes. Yes, indeed. And then the pause, the moment, why are you looking at me like that? Me. And it just struck me that it would so ruin the scene if it were that the doctor came in and pronounced her dead, if it were even Rodolfo's acknowledging she is dead, that it removes the connectedness that we feel. We have to be invested, and we're watching to see, oh yes, I reached the conclusion. She's dead. Now he's reaching that conclusion. And it just makes it so much more powerful, a tragedy than spelling it out. It's related to the old saw about, show don't tell when you're writing, and that kind of thing. But that struck me in a really powerful way, how smart the libretto is. I do almost want to cut the Schaunard line just a little bit, or maybe not translate it in the titles, so that it somehow is.
You don't have to show the words.
No,
people should be watching the stage at that moment. They don't need to know.
They're so locked in on the staging here.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you the staging. So this is Alain Gauthier is the director for this production. And at the very end, there is a wall, you may have seen in photos, there's a wall of window that raises, and there's a cutout of the skyline of Paris. And this raises, and then one by one, each of the Musetta and Marcello and two of the others, then they turn their backs they turn their backs on Mimi and Rodolfo, and they look out into what is the unknown, and what Mimi's dead. We're 20 years old, 22 years old. What's life ahead for us? And another way to stage it would be they're all around the bed, happy but sad family, but together. And this way, they're all individually going to go on this tragic journey about discovering who they are and what lies next for them. Really, very powerful ending. I was. And
really my theory that Rodolfo and Musetta wind up together 20 years later, and Puccini did that. La Rondine.
Oh, that's great.
Magda and Ruggiero.
He never acknowledged that.
He didn't say that, but if I asked him, he would have admitted to it, because they're the same characters 20 years on. And this is their evolution. And although one is set in like 1916 and the other in 1830, but in terms of their aging, actually, we shouldn't say that. Maybe it's the 1850s, but the way they progress as people and how they sort of find one another, but then it can't quite work because Magda Musetta cannot break her old patterns of how she interacts with men. And Rodolfo Ruggiero ultimately realizes that he has to be the poet, he has to suffer. And to me, it's continuity. And if you want to do it, sometimes we do both operas in repertoire, you'll see the resonance that have, and even if you can't have the same singers do both roles.
Yes. Right.
That would be very, very interesting. So
I like the idea.
friends, this is what opera people do. Get used to it.
Exactly.
There is a question I've wanted to ask you for a long time, and it doesn't only apply to you, and it doesn't only apply to Cincinnati, but I think Cincinnati could be a very interesting example of this. And I'm going to tiptoe around politics and all that, but Cincinnati is a city that in many ways represents a lot of America in its beauty and its strengths, but also in its frailties and its incongruities and inconsistencies.
Yep.
And leave it at that. But just describing before the geography, the river, the historic racism, the present racism, sexism, ideas about what art should be. There was a famous demonstration a number of years ago in Cincinnati about a photography exhibit that some people considered indecent. Other people said freedom of expression, we should show what we want. I remember an opera production at CCM before I think I met you, of Faust, in which they had an announcement about the quote adult content may give offense to certain people. And you and Evans and Patricia Beggs and even Nick Muni before program things that do challenge, that do provoke, that, you know, there are people who may have objected to Fellow Travelers. There are people who may have objected to Nick Muni's Traviata years ago that said it in contemporary times with AIDS being the disease rather than tuberculosis. How in a community that you live in, and I say you collectively, Evans, but the entire company, do you program in such a way that you are artistically valid? And certainly this season that you described addresses that a lot, because certainly Aida and La Boheme could be about contemporary issues, but also Fierce and the other operas you're doing, maybe not Pirates of Penzance, can be about today, about us, and so on. What if there are people who object?
Well, the first thing I'll say is you're right. And there were concerns expressed about, and there have been concerns expressed about content in the past. And it's always a judgment call how you want to be out in front of your audience. You have to be out in front of your audience. In other words, you have to be ahead of them in terms of programming. You just don't want to get too far out in front of them. And when we do an opera that has that requires sensitive content, which some people will find offensive, and other people will find it offensive that you consider it sensitive content, that's when it gets really difficult. I discreetly pulled up a letter that I wrote on behalf of Patty and Evans in advance of Fellow Travelers. And I think for me, I'll just read a little part of this here. For me, this is what is our commitment and our vision, and what is the answer for when we have these difficult to manage works or productions. So the other, and I'll just mention this other layer first. I'm reminded as I see the letter that, oh my gosh, when we did Fellow Travelers, it was also just days after the horrific shooting in the Orlando club.
Yeah.
And so we had been working on a communication to our subscribers, and then that happened as we were writing the letter. So we just added a final note here, and this is what the note said. We drafted this letter on Saturday before the unspeakably horrific and heartbreaking news out of Orlando. Like you, we have asked how this could happen yet again and what can be done to prevent such things in the future. Questions that will persist for months, even years. For now, and this is the part that I want to be sure to share. For now, we look forward to coming together for the opera season, when we'll once again be reminded that great art exposes injustice, teaches tolerance, engenders compassion, and always insists on love. And that gets a little bit philosophical and goes, for me, and I know for Patty and I know for Evans as well, to the whole reason we're in the business in the first place, because opera, as one of the great arts and the works within them that within the art form that we consider great, it's part of our mission as humans is to expose injustice and teach tolerance and engender compassion. What we know is that opera has the power to do that, and it can be a slow burn sometimes, but opera will change people, and it has the power to make a person discover that they can have sympathy for someone that's totally different from them, and someone that maybe they didn't respect before they watched the show, but now they understand. And that sympathy and it's compassion, and opera's great about calling out injustice. I think some of the greatest operas, whether it's on a human scale or a societal scale, and that's one of the thrilling things about the art form, is that often there's justice in opera. Mm-hmm. And it insists on love too. The art form insists on love. The great works, it points that direction. Often that love doesn't get to be satisfied, but it reminds us what right and wrong is in so many ways. And so that's where, for us, that's where I know we rest, and that's what we take comfort in. And the only other thing, practically speaking, I would say, is that in everything we do, no matter how much we disagree with a patron who might feel strongly about something, it's, well, I don't want to share specific examples because they're just a little too painful to share.
Yeah.
Comments that we might hear from patrons about a casting decision or about a particular subject matter and how wrong we are to put that on a stage or something like that. But we, no matter what, treat them, even if we don't get it either before or after, with respect. And we listen, and I myself make it a point to reach out to patrons, and you hear some things you wish you wouldn't have heard sometimes, but I always feel like we're making progress to listen, we're making progress to engage in the conversation, and even if it's just a little bit of progress, that's better than saying you're wrong and hanging up the phone or what have you. But for me, that's the driver, and so I was glad that the search function worked on my on my
well,
Windows.
We're concluding now, my friend. I always love talking to you, but our time is almost at its end. I'm just going to give you a little tool to use whenever you deal with that issue that has always worked for me. When people give me an earful about whatever content or whatever they don't like in some contemporary opera, or even Wozzeck, or things that are not brand new, or Peter Grimes or whatever, I always say to them, do you like Puccini? Oh, I love Puccini. Which opera do you like the most? And I let them name whichever opera they love the most. And then I say, well, let's take apart that story. And the way these men behave, whether it's Calaf allowing the slave girl to die and everybody to be beheaded, or Turandot beheading everyone, or Mimi who leads Rodolfo along, or Rodolfo, who's a terrible coward, or Tosca, who's very complicated, Scarpia, certainly. Mario is noble, but he's blind in a lot of ways. The characters in Madame Butterfly, we feel sorry for her. The abuse heaped on her, the sexism, the racism, the religious intolerance in the opera Madame Butterfly. You could Manon Lescaut, they're all tramps, is what someone said to me. But the point is, you can take any Puccini opera. It's such an easy thing to do because everyone, I love Puccini. And then you show them, this is not new. Opera provides lessons about human behavior, about our inconsistencies and so on. And what makes it great and what makes us great is our humanity. And opera is a reflection of the humanity. And Puccini, I mean, I'm a Verdi man, but Puccini always does that for people. And it works. And it's the answer to every question is old Giacomo Puccini.
I love it. That's great. And so accurate and true. Yeah.
So Chris Milligan, wonderful to see you. People
Brett,
listening, Cincinnati Opera has just begun its season. Are you counting this as your 100th, or even though it's 102 years ago, but we had a pandemic?
It's our 102nd year.
Okay. 102 years of quality over 100 seasons.
There you something like that. Yes.
Thank you very much. Keep up the good work. Fred. And I hope to see you soon.
I look forward to the next time we're together in person.
That would be a pleasure. Give my best to everyone in Cincinnati.